So you've probably heard that it's best to reduce your intake of processed food as much as possible and increase your intake of whole foods for optimal health. That's what a lot of people recommend, and that's what I recommend as well. But in reality, what are processed foods? And are processed foods really bad? Are all processed foods equal? So first of all, what are processed foods? So according to the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, processed foods includes foods that have been cooked, canned, frozen, packaged, or changed in nutritional composition with fortifying, preserving, or preparing in different ways. And anytime we cook, bake, or prepare food, we're processing food. So actually, nearly all foods that are processed, at least to some extent, like if you're eating frozen veggies that have been pre-cut, even if there's like zero additives to them and it's literally just veggies that have been cut and frozen, then it's processed, technically. The different types of processed foods. So foods aren't just automatically unhealthy because they've been processed. You also need to look at the degree of this processing. And for this, we can look at the NOVA food classification system, which has its flaws, but it's a good way to get a general overview of the different categories of processed foods and to go from like foods that are really minimally processed to ultra processed foods. So NOVA helps people group foods according to the degree and the purpose of processing that they go through. Food processing, as identified by NOVA, means all of the physical, biological, and chemical aspects, processes that a food has to go through before it is actually prepared into a meal. So it doesn't involve anything that you would do to it, like cutting and cooking. There are 4 groups in this NOVA food classification. So the first group is foods that are not processed or that are very minimally processed. I'm going to leave links in the description so that you can go check out exactly all of the different classifications and the different aspects of each one if you're interested in that, but I'm just going to give you like the general picture here. And in this first food group, you can find foods like fruit and vegetables and like grains, beans, or any type of legumes, nuts and seeds, and also animal products that haven't been like meat that is still whole, that hasn't been like ground or anything like that, seafood, milk, yogurt with like nothing added to it, all of these things. The second food group is processed culinary ingredients. Basically, it's things that you can use to cook the food from the first category, and that is like directly extracted from these foods. This includes things like oil, butter, sugar, honey, syrup, all of these things. The third group is the processed foods group, and these are the foods from the first and second categories where we have added something to it, something like oil, salt, sugar, canned vegetables that are stored in like salt or vinegar, things like that, and also fruits that are stored in like sugar, syrup, things like that. Also bacon and like canned fish, things like that are in this category. And then number 4 is the ultra processed category, and this is where you find foods that you can hardly tell that they come from like group 1 foods. They have been made from multiple different sources, and it's hard to recognize the actual food that they come from. And these are all the things like snacks, like fatty, sugary snacks, biscuits or cookies, ice cream, chocolate, candy, soda, then any pre-prepared like meals, pizza, pre-made burgers, like burger patties, all of these things are into the ultra processed foods category. Now again, like I've mentioned, this doesn't necessarily mean that all of the ultra processed foods are like really unhealthy for you and bad for you, and that the number 1 foods are necessarily like super good for you. Based on scientific research, the scientific consensus, meat, like red meats, aren't great for your health, yet they are in group 1 foods. They are not processed, which technically is kind of weird to me because the animal like eats processed foods and then the animal is like killed and then the meat is taken from that animal, and then like I don't know, it's just weird to think about. But so that is group 1, and then if you take group 4, like if you take bean and like lentil burger patties that you get like already made at the store, then that's like type 4. You have to take many things into consideration, different aspects, and not just the degree of transformation that the food has gone through. But again, this is good for you to get a general idea. But another kind of simpler way to look at it, and the way that I like to view processed foods, is to use Dr. Greger's definition, and that is that whole unprocessed foods are foods where you have added nothing bad or taken away nothing good. And so that's another way to view things. Are processed foods actually that bad? So if we're talking about minimally processed foods, then no, they aren't bad, and they actually have certain benefits. Like for instance, the convenience. If you're getting food that has already been processed to some degree, then that means that you're going to do less work in order to get it into your mouth and like your meal. And that can also be an easier way to eat healthier, because if you don't feel like getting fresh veggies and cutting them up and doing all of that, but you can get like this canned ratatouille that has, okay, maybe some additives to it, but it's still better than not eating veggies at all. So you can also see it in that sense. And there are some additives to these processed foods which are beneficial. Like you can have preservatives, and that can help with storage, and so it can help save money as well, because you can buy a food and you don't have to eat it right away. It's not going to expire right away. You can wait a little bit. And also some of these additives include like supplementation. So for instance, I'm really happy that the soy milk that I buy is fortified in calcium and in vitamin B12. I think that that's awesome. And even if it counts as like ultra processed because of that, I don't mind, because it's giving me a good source of these vitamins that I otherwise wouldn't be having. And the price is also another factor, which is in favor of most like highly processed foods, because yes, if you get like fruit, it's going to be cheaper than getting like a processed meal, but the fruit is not going to feed an entire family of like 6 people. But if you get like processed pre-made pizza, then you know that is, I'm not saying that you should be doing that or that it's better. I'm just saying that, you know, it's a privilege for a lot of people to be able to make this choice between non-processed foods and processed foods. So with all of that being said, if we're looking at highly processed foods in general, then they are definitely not as good for your health as most unprocessed foods or minimally processed foods. They are most of the time less nutrient dense. So if you eat like 200 calories of ultra processed foods, you may not be getting enough fiber, you may not be getting enough vitamins, minerals, protein, things like that. Usually ultra processed foods are highly refined as well, so again, you're going to be lacking most good nutrients. Ultra processed foods are also much higher in calories, which for most people is a downside. And if you're trying to watch out for like your calorie amount and you're trying not to eat too much and have like too big portions, then it's going to be much harder to do that when you're eating mainly highly processed foods, as they are very calorie dense and also they are highly palatable. So you're more likely to exceed your calorie limit than if you're eating like a bowl of veggies, fruit, quinoa, things like that. And also they do contain additives. Now, while not all of them are bad, I made a video on the truth about additives and preservatives that you can check out here, but it is important to know that, you know, you're gonna find more of these than in whole foods, and also they usually contain more salt, more sugar, more fat, things like that, which are not beneficial long term. And then if we look at studies to back that up, consistently research shows that people who eat diets that are high in ultra processed foods have more risk of developing diseases and have a generally lower lifespan and have more chance of being obese. Some of these diseases include like cancer and diabetes and heart disease. And then people who eat diets that are richer in whole, minimally processed foods have better life outcomes, better life expectancy, less diseases, and overall lower BMIs. Again, this doesn't mean that you should be scared of processed foods at all. I hope that this video is balanced enough so that you understand that you're able to still eat ultra processed foods once in a while and that certain processed foods do have benefits, but you also know that it's important that you incorporate more whole foods into your diet, and that will be better for your health in general. How can you eat less processed foods and more whole foods? So now that we know that processed foods are okay, but ultra processed foods need to be avoided as much as possible, and that whole foods need need to be consumed as much as possible, here are a few tips to kind of do this transition without it being too painful. And the main thing I would recommend is that you focus on what you could be adding instead of what you can be taking away. This is a really, really big tip that I share with all of my clients, because if you're focusing on all of the processed foods that you're not allowed to eat anymore, if you're telling yourself, I can't have my favorite cookies anymore because it's super processed, I can't have my favorite burgers because they're super processed, I can't have this ready-made meal that really saves my life every Tuesday night because I don't have time to cook. You know, if you're thinking about all of this, then it's going to be really, really hard to have a sustainable and balanced diet, because you're going to be in restriction and then you're going to end up binging on all of these foods. Instead of focusing on this, you should really try focusing on all of the great, delicious, non-processed foods that you can add into your diet. If you're more focused about creating a meal around one particular vegetable that you love, or having one fruit that you love for dessert, or making a meal around like your favorite grain, if you're focusing on all of these things, then naturally you will have less room for the ultra-processed foods, and it won't seem like you just have to cut them out of your life entirely. If you're eating mainly whole, minimally processed foods that you really enjoy and having like balanced meals where you're eating enough, then naturally you will have less room for the ultra processed foods, and they can be like treats that you have once in a while, because if you're not labeling them as bad and focusing on the fact that you can't have them anymore, then they're not going to hold this huge power over you, and you're going to be able to have a healthy, balanced meal and then have a cookie if you want, or have a pizza night and then have a salad the next day. You're going to be able to balance that out. But again, you need to focus on all the great things that you can add. And then also, if you want to do more focused work in your quest to replacing your highly processed foods by more whole foods, then I suggest that you take it little by little and that you do like step by step, following the different groups. You don't all of a sudden want to replace your like orange soda by one fresh orange, you know, that's going to be a little bit difficult to do right away. But you can start replacing your favorite orange soda by freshly squeezed orange juice, and then after a while maybe you can try a real orange, and then you have to do that little by little. And you can also find alternatives, like if your favorite meal is this pre-made pizza that you buy from the grocery store that you just have to pop in the oven, try to buy these ingredients on your own and to make your own dough and to make your own pizza. Much easier to do this than to just be like, I'm never going to have that pizza again, I'm going to have a salad instead. And finally, you really need to try and make whole foods as convenient as processed foods, because if you get home from a long day of work and you have to build an entire meal from scratch, that's not as appealing as if you could just pop a pizza into the oven, like a pre-made pizza. So this is where meal planning and meal prepping comes in. If you're able to prep your meals on one day so that you have your meal ready every single day, that's ideal, but that's not always possible. So a tip that I like to use when I'm cooking for just myself is that I cook like every other day, and then every time I cook, I double the portions so that I have leftovers for the day to come, and that at least takes one day of cooking away. What you can also do is rely on foods that are minimally processed, so that they don't really count as processed foods, like frozen or canned veggies, things like that, pre-cooked, like baked beans, lentils, things like that as well. That's it for this video. So remember that you should be eating as much whole, minimally processed foods as possible, and try to limit ultra processed foods. But that doesn't mean that ultra-processed foods are automatically unhealthy or bad for you, or that you should cut them out of your life entirely. As usual, it's all about balance. And if you're able to incorporate ultra-processed foods that you really enjoy in your diet once in a while, then it's actually healthier for you than trying to eat like super clean and perfect and cut everything out and then go on a binge then restrict diet. So please remember that, find the right balance. So don't forget to like this video and subscribe, and see you on my next one. Bye.